Okay, Vanessa, if we had an award for the most fun meets the most data nerdiest episode we've ever done, this would be it. Emily Oster is just the guru of all gurus when it comes to breaking down data in the world of parenting. She also might be our new best friend.
One can only hope, Cara. Now, you will hear Emily refer to herself as not a people person, but you will be amazed at how wrong she is about herself because she's a total blast. And we cannot wait for you to hear this fascinating and hilarious episode. Enjoy.
I love how we just threw her under the bus in her intro, but really what we mean is, Emily, you're the greatest. Come back all the time.
Hi, Emily.
Hi.
How are you? We're
I'm
so
good.
excited to have
I'm
you
excited.
here.
This is great. Thank you for having me.
So you guys might know that I don't really get starstruck all that easily, but this is like, I'm feeling a little bit starstruck today. Emily, you were like, Beyonce could walk on the Zoom and I'd be like, okay. But having you here is like kind of a big deal.
I'm sorry, Beyonce would also be a big deal.
Beyonce would also be a big deal. Well, that's very nice of you to say. And I'm a big fan of you guys. So I'm just excited to talk about, I don't know, parenting, puberty.
We're going everywhere with it. Okay, here's where I'd love to start. I want to start by calling out the Venn diagram overlap between what you do and what we do. You talk about this actually a lot on your own podcast and in your own newsletter. You talk about being an economist who looks at medical issues and healthcare issues and science issues. You're very medicine adjacent. I come from medicine training and I'm very data adjacent. And there's so much overlap there. So I want to start by asking how it feels to be medicine adjacent, and specifically to ask if you are comfortable or uncomfortable with people taking your advice as medical advice.
It's an extremely good question. And I would say that I have a particular way that I would like people to take my advice. And I'll tell you what that is. And then I will tell you, when I get worried. So, I think the best use of the things I'm putting out in parent data or in the newsletter, in the books, all of the places that I put out the content, is to absorb it as data. And then when it comes to when the parts of it that are really about medical decision-making, to bring that to the conversations you have with your providers. And to be clear, like some of what I write about is like really parenting. And there it's just the data and you're going to make the choice. And actually, if you went to ask your pediatrician about it, they would be like, well, here are a few resources, but this isn't really a medical question. But then there are things, particularly in pregnancy, where it really is a medical question. And I think what the book can do in its sort of best use case is to get people one step further towards understanding the context to have a good conversation. And so I think that's what I would like people to do. I think there are places where I do want to make sure that people are bringing their individual circumstances to their doctors when they are looking for medical advice, because at the end of the day, even if I believe, and I very strongly do, that the data that I'm putting out is the best data and is very reliable and it is still an average almost always. Even when we say like we have a large randomized trial, we're still picking up the average. So let me give you one concrete example, which is people ask me a lot about induction at 39 weeks, which is really a question about what is the right medical treatment. And so what I can say to that, what I can talk about is, here is the biggest randomized trial we have of this. Here's what we knew before. Here's what this big randomized trial says. Here's what here's what we learned from it. Here's what we don't learn from it. But that isn't going to tell you like you should have an induction or you shouldn't have an induction. It's a block of data, a block of information to bring to that conversation. And I think if people leave that and they're like, okay, Emily says don't have an induction, which just to be clear is not what I would say. That's not a good outcome for me. That's not how I want people to take the work.
Right. I love that. When I used to see patients in the office, the way that I would frame that same concept would be something like, the risk of this side effect is whatever, 10%. Okay. If it happens to you, it's 100%. 100%. If it doesn't happen to you, it's 0%. Yeah. And so you have to take that number 10% and sort of layer on top of it your own risk stratification, your own comfort with what does that risk look like? And by the way, 10% happens a lot. It happens 10% of the time. I love it. Do you ever wish you were a doctor or went to medical school, given how much of this information you end up putting out there?
Sometimes I do think that would have been useful. But the thing is that, like, for what I'm doing, the training that I have in data analysis is so important. And unfortunately, that actually isn't the kind of training we get as much in medical school. I mean, I spent that is like my PhD is in like data analysis. My academic writing is in data analysis. I like publish papers in statistics journals about data. Like, that's my thing. I don't think I would get that. So I think in some ways I'm bringing a perspective that's a bit like complementary, let's say.
Totally. Although you would have been a really good doctor.
Thank you. I don't know. I mean, I'm not great with people, which I feel like is a downside of, I don't know.
Well, it hasn't really stopped a lot of people from becoming doctors, Emily. So
I was waiting for your comeback.
No comment. I'm not a doctor, although, and I like literally every episode, I'm like, just so we're clear, I'm not a doctor. I play one on TV. Just kidding. One of the things that we are surprised by, I mean, we shouldn't be because Cara is a physician and has been known as a physician for many decades, is how many healthcare professionals use our podcast and our newsletter to inform their work. And it's like, it's so flattering because I'm like, well, A, because I'm not a doctor, but B, because I'm like, wait, but you're the person in the room all the time. Like, you are the expert. And I would imagine that they use your data all the time. Yeah. And I'm wondering, what recommendations do you have for the people who are seeing, patient after patient and after patient and don't have time to like sit and read through studies or the research or whatever that we do? What do you recommend to them, Emily?
So it's interesting because I actually wouldn't even say the issue is not having time to read through the studies or be up to date. Actually, many of the people who I think will recommend my books to their patients, it's not because they're like, I can't keep up with the research. That's absolutely not what this is delivering. It's like, I don't have time to get you to where you need to be for us to have the conversations you want to have. And so people, and I bet it's a similar thing here, which is like, I've got 20 minutes with you at this visit and we got a bunch of stuff we want to get done. And I want you to feel really informed. So when we get to the harder questions, you're ready to talk about them. But I don't have time. And so those are the doctors who will tell me like, I'll give your book to them because then you have a lot of the answers. Then they can come back to me. We can have we can have the conversations we need to have. And I think I bet that's what's going on some of this here too, is that people are thinking of what you're doing as really giving people much more information than they could in the limited time.
And I'll say, from the perspective of someone who worked in medicine for a long time and who's married to someone who is still working in a clinical setting, those physicians don't have any time beyond, there's just no bandwidth. Every piece of extra time has now been subsumed by the electronic medical record. And that just takes hours and hours and hours of their day, every day. And so they are gobbling up your data because it is like, it's not metadata. It's not, going to a one study that looks at 25 studies and throws out all the outliers and sort of hones in on a question. It is, your data is honed data. It is very different. It's high quality focused data. And that's what I see on the clinical side is people are hungry for what you do because they don't have time to educate themselves. If I went to medical school in the 90s and I know I'm really up to date with what happened in the 90s. But if I don't have time to read, and it took leaving, this is so sad, but it took leaving practice to have time to read.
And I think that some of what I'm doing is trying to provide a kind of high level discussion of this new research that is nevertheless digestible. So it isn't up to date. It's funny, usually up to date. Like it isn't up to date, which is a resource for doctors, which has a lot of material like this, but is very, very, very hyper dense.
Cara holds it over my head every day that she has access to up to date.
Don't tell anyone.
I had to buy my university shut down our access to up to date, and I had to buy it. I was very disappointed.
She's like, Vanessa, you can have my password. She's like, sorry, let me go check up to date. You can't check up to date, but I can check up to date.
But Vanessa is now like, I really don't need up to date because I have parent data and it's much clearer and much shorter, and I can read it.
Put into readable.
And I can listen to it while shouting at my dog. So Emily, let's dive in to some juicy topics.
Yeah.
And I want to start with one of our favorite topics and your favorite topics, which is sleep.
Oh,
I know.
So into it.
I'm so into it. And you're so into it. And Cara basically,
I'm going to bed now.
It's like that doll where you pull the string and it's like they have one line that they say. And she's basically like, sleep is so important. Sleep is so important. Sleep is so important. Okay. And you've read our book. And you very generously blurbed our book. So if you buy our book for no other reason, it's because Emily says our book is so good. Thank God. And so what does the data tell us about why sleep is so important? And follow-on question, what do we still not know? What data do we not have about sleep do you wish we had?
Yeah. So let me start with the second thing. And at least in the question about sleep that I think is the most unclear for to researchers, is we don't know why we sleep. We don't know you couldn't say the reason that you sleep is X, but we know that it must be unbelievably important because every animal sleeps. Right. Every animal, including dolphins, they sleep half their brain at one time and half the brain at the other. Just there's something that must be so, so crucial, because laying down for, 7 hours at night when you could be eaten by a saber-tooth tiger, that seems really stupid. So it's got to be delivering something really good if animals are going to eat you. And so we know, but we don't know what that is. And I think people have different theories, and there's versions of it. We have some idea, but it's not a sort of super well understood piece of science. So I think that for me, that's the most interesting unknown about sleep. The thing we do know about sleep is that if you don't get enough of it, it's bad for your functioning. And we know that because that's actually not a hard thing to experiment with. So you can bring people into a sleep lab, you can have them not sleep all night, you can do things to them afterwards. They're stupid. It's like they're drunk. Eventually, if you don't sleep, you literally will die. Those are experiments in rats, not in people. But
it feels like when you have an infant, you're close to that experiment.
And the experience with little kids and with even with sort of postpartum depression, I think we really, some of postpartum depression is beyond sleep, but actually one of the first things, if you sort of screen positive on a postpartum depression screen, particularly if you're screening in sort of the not at the more extreme end, but at the sort of partial end, one of the first things to tell people is can you figure out a way to sleep more? Because not sleeping in a consistent way, even if you're sleeping a little bit, is a substantial contributor to problems with mental health.
Yeah.
That's in adults. Then we look at kids, and you can see that it's not, you can't do experiments where you keep them up all night, but you can do experiments where you ask their parents to keep them up an hour later for 4 days in the week. And that turns out to be terrible. Kids do their, even a few days of a little bit less sleep. And, you sort of, as a parent, you kind of know that. There was one time that my daughter, we went for coffee or tea, we went for tea. And I gave her in the afternoon after school, and she had an item which turned out to be a very highly caffeinated tea. And I don't know what was wrong with me. And she was up until 1 a.m. She must have been in the 4th grade or something. She was up till 1 o'clock. She just couldn't go to sleep because she'd be done this at 5 o'clock. And she was so upset. So then the next day she's like a zombie. And they were taking these multiplication tests. They would take them every week. And like the previous week, she had gotten, 50 multiplications in whatever the time. And this week she got like 18. Her teacher was like, what happened? I was just like, literally this fucking day. And so then what was really interesting about that, and I think is part of what maybe we can talk about with older kids, is like that experience was incredibly informative for her. Like it's something she brings up. I mean, she's now, that was 3 years ago. She's now much older. It's an experience she brings up all the time. Like, remember that time you gave me the tea? And some of it is to say how terrible I am and things, but it's also like it really ingrained in her this idea that like sleep is super, super important. And it's something I want to prioritize.
And I just want to say, and then Cara, ask your question. If you haven't read The Family Firm, you will appreciate how emotionally intelligent Emily's daughter is. She may be the one who should be a doctor and have good bedside manner because she's the one who gives you all sorts of coping mechanisms and calming exercises and all of that. So not every child will take one experience 3 years ago and carry it with them and inform their bedtime routine forever and ever. That's exceptional. All children will remember it and blame their parents for having screwed up.
Definitely.
But they won't all use it constructively. Okay, Cara, the
data there is 100%. Yeah. So what I was going to say is that description you used where she was trying to go to sleep and she was laying there and she was anxious about it. So the thing that we hear from kids and the adults in their lives very consistently through the puberty years is that sometimes it's that, I hesitate to use the word anxiety because I think that's a loaded word, but it's that frustration. It's that sort of cycle of I'm trying to go to sleep. My brain or my body is not ready for whatever reason. Maybe Emily poisoned you with a high dose of caffeine. Perhaps it is possible. Or maybe, whatever, you can't turn your brain off. And then that in and of itself keeps kids up and they get in this cycle where they're trying so desperately to sleep and they can't. And that frustration is it's very tangible and it has real implications. So some of this, when we talk about data about sleep, I think it is helpful to the listeners to remember that while sleep is really important, pressuring kids to get sleep doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't plug the hole.
I agree. And I think when the issue for parents, the thing that parents can do is provide the opportunities for sleep. So when I talk about this with people, I think the biggest issue that I see in the way we're structuring some of our lives is that we're not providing those opportunities. That, because of the way, particularly as your kids get older, that like school and sports and all this stuff happens, find yourself in a situation in which you're really only able to provide your kid with, 7 hours of the night that they could be asleep. Even if they were to like fall asleep the second that their head hit the pillow and wake up at the moment of their alarm, forgetting about it, these kind of frustrations and complicated insomnia and things, but that's not enough time. Like that's not enough sleep. It's difficult to explain to people and for people to absorb. Sometimes you just might not be able to do some things.
That's right. And likewise, I think it's important in the same way that we talked about data is an average and that there are outliers in the data, for sleep, there are recommendations about how much sleep an individual needs at a given age. But there are people who need more and there are people who they really don't need as much as the recommendations say. And as a parent, I will say that you have to just try as best you can to set things up for success where your kids can get into the recommended window. But if you're getting them in bed and they're going to sleep and they're doing everything right and they're waking up an hour earlier than you had hoped, and that is their rhythm, that is their rhythm. That is at a certain point, not everyone fits the paradigm, but most people fit this paradigm.
But I also think this is a place where, again, sort of individual feedback is really accessible. I mean, if your kid there's some very simple ways you can think about, whether your kid is getting enough sleep. Are they falling asleep in the middle of the day? If you let them sleep in on the weekends, are they sleeping for 2 hours? If you let your kid sleep until whatever you want on Saturday and they're still getting up at 6, I guess your kid wakes up at 6 and that's fine. And, that's okay. Too bad for you. I hope that you have a TV in their room so they don't bother you.
Oh my God. God forbid. If my kids had TVs in their rooms, it would be like They would never leave ever again. They would never sleep.
True.
They'd never talk to me. But you do say the good news, and this is something that comes up across every single topic we talk to parents about, which is like, once you find yourself in a situation, it's really common for people to say, the horse has left the barn. There's nothing I can do, like with tech, with sleep, with eating habits, with, drugs and alcohol, all this stuff. And what you talk about with sleep is like, no, you can make real change, and you can make real change actually fairly quickly. So what recommendations or advice do you have for parents of older kids where you don't just capitulate? Like, there are things, I mean, we give our advice ad nauseum, but I'd love for people to hear from you what you see as some easy ways to address it.
Well, first of all, I read your book, so maybe it's just going to sound like the same advice because people should just be listening to you. But what I will say is I think that often in our families, we are missing opportunities to engage our kids in these decision-making processes that involve some follow-up. So sleep is a good example. Tech is a good example where, like, if you want to set some limits, if you want to set a limit with your 5-year-old or you want to enforce a bedtime, you just say you don't get the iPad. And then what happens is they're mad and then they eventually forget. But like ultimately, like at that age, like you're the decider. You're seeing them all the time. You get to make the rules. But you don't get to make the rules with your 14-year-old in the same way. And trying to make rules in that way is going to lead to probably in many cases interactions where then they don't tell you things and they're hiding it, and that's not good. But they are also old enough, hopefully, to engage in some sort of self-reflection, in some discussion. So I think there is a point here as a family to sort of think about like sitting down and saying, are we like, how can we manage some relationship with technology or with sleep? Like, what would it take to get to sleeping more if we think that that's important? And how would we know if it was working? Right? I mean, kids are like, all people like feedback. And so thinking about like, okay, how would we know if more sleep was making you feel better? What can we do to get that information? I mean, not everybody likes data, but I think that there are, with some kids, at least, you got to read out your own kid. But I think that there are opportunities to have these conversations more broadly inside the family, rather than saying like, my rule is you must go to bed at this time, to say like, hey, how can we experiment with this in a way that like potentially is beneficial to you, with the opening that like, if it turns out that you're a person who doesn't need much sleep, like that, I'm not going to make a rule that enforces you have to be in bed at 9.
Have you ever thought about writing for tweens and teens and presenting the data to them? Because I think there's a huge group that would actually love the data.
It's an interesting, I mean, I haven't thought about that, but I partly I think is, as Vanessa said, my older kid is sort of very much on the tail of like wanting to absorb this kind of thing for herself. And so I feel like some of my instincts maybe are not right. But I do actually think this data, so when you talk about, particularly about sort of sleep and some of these, I do actually think kids are they're more interested in data, in this kind of evidence than you might think.
100%. I mean, when we explain brain science
to kids, is the best.
It rocks their world. They're so into it. It feels like, oh my God, really? Like now I understand. They're
not alone. They're not being told to do something. They're being explained why it's happening.
Totally.
Particularly in those moments of puberty when it's like, why is everything all, why am I so sad?
Especially when everyone has fill in the blank, right. Whatever it is, everyone has.
I mean, I just love kids.
Can we go there with tech since you brought it up?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I don't think any of us on this podcast are anti-tech or sort of, I don't think we're rigid about it. We recognize the fluidity of both the tech itself. It keeps evolving. And then the limit setting that has to happen in a home. We all have kids who are in and around the age of tweendom and teendom. So let's go to the data.
Mm-hmm.
What does the data say a quote healthy tech diet looks like? What help us understand?
Okay, so this is not a place where the data is great. So certainly you can pull out data that I think would be very concerning about, the sort of relative mental health struggles of kids who engage more or less with social media. Now, and I think here there's often a distinction between sort of like passive tech and kind of social media tech. And I think that most of our most concerning evidence is around kind of social media stuff. That evidence has the issue that like the kinds of kids who are engaged a lot with social media are different in other ways. You don't actually know which direction the causality would go. Is it that I'm engaging with social media because I'm having other problems? Is it that I'm, and at the same time, there's a huge amount of heterogeneity. So for some kids, like social media is a place that they find their people or that they can connect in ways that are really healthy. And for some kids, it's just a kind of comparison trap that makes them much less happy. So it's unfortunate that we both from this data don't know the average impact. And also for your own individual kid would have no idea, even if we knew the average impact, like which part of the distribution is your kid in. In a broad sense, I think there is some reason to be concerned based on, what happened when we introduced Facebook to college campuses and sort of on average depression went up. So I think I am very, as a parent, quite anxious about I do not let my kids engage on social media. And I'm hoping to not let them do that for a long period of time. But what I do recognize is that it's actually very hard to hold. It's very hard to hold that line. And it's in some ways, it clearly has costs for them in terms of their social interactions. And so the whole thing is just a hot mess.
It's a hot mess.
Yeah.
Hot
I mean,
mess.
I had a situation this spring where I had so I have 4 kids, Emily. My youngest is 13. My oldest
so many,
is 20.
Vanessa. Okay.
It's so many, Emily.
That's why I look so goddamn tired.
I can't believe you have a 20. You actually look 20. You look amazing. Okay. That's not the topic of this podcast.
It's the filter. It's the filter on my Zoom screen. When it says like improve your appearance, it's like all the way at the end of the dial. So I had 2 interesting things, and I'd be curious to hear from you how you would handle this as both a researcher and a parent. I explicitly told my daughter that she was going to get social media later than her 2 older brothers did, because the research tells us that girls are disproportionately affected, and they're affected between the ages of 11 to 13, whereas boys, they're seeing it impacted from 14 to 15. And she's like a fairly with it, thoughtful kid, and we had the conversation and it was fine. Great. I don't know if wielding data in that way is effective. Like we talked about how much kids love science and kids love data. I can't tell if data that feels amorphous or sort of like conceptual is an effective tool to wield when explaining to kids our decisions. And I'll do the follow-up, and then I'd love your feedback. My youngest kid secretly got on Snapchat several months before he was 13 and before he was allowed. He's a terrible liar, which was helpful. And I figured it out quickly because he was looking at his Snap map while sitting in the back of a car with me. God bless him. But after he talked to me about the opportunity cost of not being on it, when, quote, everyone else is on it, we engaged in that conversation, right? So in one sense, I laid down the law with data on my side, and it was to good effect. The second time I laid down the law with data on my side, and I was missing some of the social emotional elements. And so I'm just sort of curious where you sit in that. And it looks like Cara has an additional question.
I'm raising my hand.
You're raising your hand.
I'm raising my hand.
She's
like literally.
Such a goody two shoes.
Give me what's the data on that? Okay, so I'm not the economist on the podcast, but I want to put the pediatrician lens on, which is I don't know that this is a completely fair comparison, because what you
are you questioning my question? Are you undermining my question?
I am putting an asterisk next to your question, because I think what you did in the first scenario is you basically said, I'm changing the rules for you. And there's a reason why, and I want you to know why, but everyone else's rules are this and your rule is that. And I think there's a confounding effect there where I think, just psychologically that the tween and teen responses, that is unfair. And so I think they're really two separate questions, right? Because you have to take that layer.
I mean, they really are
but
two separate questions, but I felt bad taking two questions in a row. So I just knocked them together.
Okay. Great.
Well, nice try, Vanessa.
So Emily, there are two questions for you. And
okay.
now I'm not even sure what I was asking, but go for it.
So it's interesting. The data piece there, in some ways, I think is a question of like whether this is what works for your kid. And I think for some kids that's like, here's the data is like a very compelling thing. And sort of what you're outlining is your two different kids had different reactions. And my guess is that is because one of your kids finds this language more compelling than the other kid, and is sort of, and probably there's a gender component to that. What I think is hard about the data in that example is implicit in that is everyone else is wrong, right? So I'm not going to let you or a lot of your friends, parents, or like other people are not right. So saying like, I'm not going to give this to you because the data shows that it's really bad. There's an unanswered question, which is, okay, but like, what about all these other people? Like if data is the reason and it's something that is an objective reason, then why is Sandra's mom not know about data? And you don't want to be like, Sandra's mom doesn't know about data. Right?
Am I allowed to say what I said next?
What did you say? I'm so curious.
She's like, everyone else is on it. And I said, define everyone else for me. Name who everyone else is. And she did. And I was like, exactly. And she didn't say
okay.
anything else.
That's an approach. It is. But I think you have to be prepared for that question. And I think I might have framed it as, because of the data, this is how our family is choosing to make this decision. And it is because we think that this is the best thing for you in the context of our family, rather than like, this is what data says. I mean, the second question about like, what do you do when your kid has disobeyed in this way? And then how do you have that conversation? I think that's a different question.
It's more about when because you were talking about how you're trying to keep your kids away from social media, and there are going to be costs to it. Balancing the social costs of tech or something else with, this is what I know to be true based on the data and my lived experience, and I'm making this choice for our family. And yet I know you're going to pay some version of a price for it, but I'm going to hold to this.
And I think part of what's hard about this is that it's like, it is so, even how problematic your kid will find that is so specific. For my older kid, like, she's the last person to get a phone. She basically never asked. We eventually got her a phone because she kind of needed one for school. But it wasn't like, I wasn't putting up with like, where's my phone? Where's my phone? And I don't think I could have taken that, basically. I just got lucky. And I think with the second kid, he's going to be, where's my phone? Where's my phone? And probably will just give in because
we're all so tired
at all.
There you go. Are there studies that look at the social costs to delaying? No. Paired up against that would be really interesting.
That would be very interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think there's all kinds of interesting stuff that one could imagine doing in this space. So
you're a mind reader, Emily. That was our next question.
I think so. Okay. So one thing I would think would be extremely interesting, which may or may not be doable, but is to think about, experimenting with delayed phone or social media, whatever it is, introduction for groups versus individuals. So, in my kind of imaginary, like, what if I were the dictator and I could do anything that I want, to basically, take one set of schools and say, the experiment here is we're going to have everybody wait until the 8th grade. We're going to say like, nobody gives their kids phones until 8th grade. Well, and you could imagine, and then in another group you say, okay, we're going to take, half the kids in the class or a quarter of the kids in the class, and we're not going to give them phones. Sort of think about like
Lord of the Flies.
Exactly. I don't think you'd really run this, but there is a question of like, that I think is very important, which is, if you took it out of the social context, if you actually made it just, we're not doing this now, is that going to improve overall mental health? Or, is that actually just the same as everybody having it? They're just bullying each other in a different way that isn't on the phone.
That's exactly right. And then the other thing is, you did call out social media as the thing that you, and I think most people are most worried about, but there's another study to be done, I think, which looks at gambling and, gaming,
Bigger
the extension
kids.
of gaming, right? And yes, and so there are other worries about having a phone that are independent of social media.
Like sleep, by the way.
Sleep.
Right.
Like sleep.
Like go circular, yes. So
I mean, one thing that I keep thinking about, I mean, Cara, I'm sorry because you're so sick of me talking about this on every episode, but I'm obsessed with phones in schools and what are schools' obligations or not to getting kids to put their phones elsewhere. Like one experiment I think that could be done is like schools that require kids to hand in their phones at the beginning of the day and pick them up at the end of the day versus schools where kids can like put them in their lockers, walk around with in their pockets and all of that. And like what the quality of the classroom experience is, what the learning acquisition is, all of that. So like, I'm very curious.
That's very doable. That feels like an extremely doable
Can
experiment.
we do it? Can we get some
Vanessa's children's school specifically?
I know I'm working on, I'm throwing myself on my sword at how poorly I've done with my youngest kid and tech because there is, I mean, Emily, your oldest is around the age of my youngest. And there is a huge generational difference. Cara's kids are the ages of my older kids. And like, there is a problem here. And I love social media and I love technology and I love texting with my friends and FaceTiming with people and seeing what people are doing. But like, we have a problem and it's getting worse.
But I'm the pessimist in the room. And I think if you did that study, you would need to look at the number of kids. You'd have to somehow exploit the number of kids who are gaming at the back of a classroom, watching videos, shopping, doing all the things.
Porn.
Right. Watching porn. So all the things, social media is optimized for phones. And when you take away phones, that solves for one bucket. But there are all of these other things that kids do on their laptops, and their laptops are going to be with them in classrooms. And so, I don't know.
I will tell you, I teach college students, and I don't let them have laptops in the classroom.
It's brilliant.
And
I love that.
And the thing is, because it's a discussion class, and I tell them, if you have something up in front of your face and, like I trust you, which it's not true, but I frame it like that. I trust you, but this is for the experience of other people. So when someone is sitting behind you, and you're messing about on your thing, that's distracting for them. And it completely, so I taught this class with and without laptops. It completely changes the experience of teaching if people are not on their laptops. And even if you let them take notes flat, it's just the kind of not having that ability to kind of be in your email and do, even if it's not porn, this focus, I think, gets lost.
Yes.
When we have laptops.
So besides, I want to move from tech and sort of concrete data to you explore harder to quantify things like feelings, like resilience and self-confidence, and you touch on happiness. I want to talk about how much can we, I know we can measure this stuff, right? There's all the strains of research out there, but I'm curious, at what point are these sort of qualitative, subjective things, how much are we able to measure them? And how much do we need to sort of let go of kind of trying to, because I came from a background where I was trying to build girl self-esteem through sports. So elementary school age girls. And I'm I know it's working. I can see it's working. The parents are coming to tell, I could see everything. But when it comes to something like self-confidence, it's we can do surveys, we can do all sorts of stuff, but can we really measure things like those kinds of emotions?
A little bit. So I wouldn't totally give up on the idea of measuring things. We can certainly measure the, potentially reductions in very bad outcomes, right? Those are the easiest things to measure, sort of diagnosed mental health disorders. That's the tail end of the stuff that we're looking at. It's easier to measure. But I do think that we have a lot of validated survey metrics that would get at some of these things. And my feeling is we should lean into those, because if we can measure something, we will focus on improving it. right? Like when you can measure like why is every evaluation of school quality about test scores? It's because we have it. It's because that's a thing that we see. And so when we ask about, that's kind of all we have about schools, even though when you ask parents, like, what do you care about in your school? They say all kinds of things that have nothing to do with like, where they fall in the test score distribution about, does my kid love learning? Are they having a good time? Do they feel like they're valued and all this other stuff? We don't measure any of that stuff. And so then we just have this one metric. And so I think the more we can say, look, we do have ways to measure these things and they can have numbers on them. You could say, I wish that we didn't have that bias, but we do have that bias. And once we have it, I think the more we can measure that stuff. And you can see in studies about bullying and resilience, we have metrics that are where we can see what are the kinds of things that impact kids' resilience to various negative shocks. And those can be measured.
But when people say, we think about this Cara and I think about this all the time. It's like, I just want my kid to be happy.
Mm-hmm.
And then other people are like, happiness shouldn't be the goal. Happiness is a byproduct of other things. Like how do you respond to that? Like, I just want my kid to be happy. Like, obviously, yes, we all want our kids. I just want my kid to be unfulfilled. No, obviously we want our kids to be happy, but like, are we also just full of shit? Like, are we saying we want that, but really we just want them to have like really good grades and high SAT scores and high paying jobs? Like, how authentic does that feel?
I think that people mean all of those things. I think part of it is like when you say, I just want my kid to be happy, some of what people mean is the way that you get happy is by like being a rich person with high SAT scores who went to an Ivy League school. The thing that I wish people thought more about or express is not like, when you say, I want my kid to be happy, I think it's misleading because your kid isn't going to be happy all the time. And that's not really what you want. You want them to be adaptive. You want them to be content. You want them to find joy and value themselves. But that doesn't mean that they're not going to be happy, that they're going to be happy all the time. And I actually think the hardest parts of parenting are kind of the part where your kid is not happy, but you can't fix it. And it's just part of being a person, right? Like their friends had a party and they didn't get invited. That thing sucks. And that sucks. And your temptation is so much to be like, well, how can I make you happy? Like, do you want an ice cream? Like those people are losers, whatever. But like, sometimes it's just like, that is sucky. And I'm sorry that
dear
happened.
Listener, those are things not to say. By the way, don't. Emily's telling you all the things not to say.
But you could say that stinks. I'm sorry that happened. And that sounds really bad. And I'm sorry. And, I'd love to hear you tell me about how you feel about that, or it's okay to feel sad about this. I think it's too much the happiness it's too vague.
And I think you're right that, sort of these quantifiable metrics of what happiness looks and feels like tend to be the goal because they're measurable, they're quantifiable, they have some inherent value, whatever that value is. Money has that value. You can do things with it. And therefore, if you have more of it, you're supposed to be happier. But we know all those studies that show that money actually does not confer happiness. That data is actually amazing when you look at it. That on the more extreme ends, people with the most money are often the least happy, which is, very, very interesting. But it's a different kind of unhappiness. So Lisa D'Amour talks about this a lot in terms of what is mental health. And mental health is adaptability. It is the ability to be in a situation, maybe a positive one, maybe a negative one, and sit with your feelings and handle those feelings and get through the situation. And I think that is what we all want for our kids. And happiness is a byproduct of that, right? And happiness is the goal. Like, having raised two kids and one out the door and the other one foot out the door, the hope is not that they're completely happy at this moment, because not that I want them to be unhappy, but then what is there to look forward to in life? And what is there to, right? So like, it's like there's
someday I will be happy.
Someday, like the joy happens intermittently and all that, and you have good friendships and good connections. And then, by the way, it's attainable in a different way at a different level as you get older. Like you can work towards this sort of something. It's sort of like if you get everything in life when you're young, sometimes you don't appreciate all those things when you're young, and then not always, and not all kids, and it depends on temperament and all that stuff. But I want to go back to data around this and understanding numbers and understanding.
You don't want to keep talking about feelings, Cara?
Well, I do actually. Yeah. That's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about sort of, Emily, you hit on it, that the hardest part of raising a kid, and I would argue this is hard for people who aren't parents as well, for grandparents who are involved in kids' lives, for teachers, mentors, healthcare providers. The hardest part is where you're watching them in a tough bind. You're watching them go through a growth opportunity, if you will, whatever you want to call it, but it's painful. And the not being invited to the party is the perfect, descriptor of, it can be bigger, it can be smaller than that, but it's, it's that feeling. And so I wonder if there is any data around how to guide kids through that, how much parents are always looking for this balance between helping, you don't want to be a crutch, you don't want to be a snowplow parent, and yet you don't want to leave your kid floundering. And has anyone looked at that?
Not really. So I think there's sort of two things in data that I would pull out there. So one is a little bit tangential, but in the question of, how much scaffolding is the right amount of scaffolding to provide your kid to get them through like school. So putting aside like my friends had a party, but like, how much should you be like making sure that their pilgrim diorama like looks awesome. Right. And I think
I was very unhelpful with that. I tried.
You made your best effort. But, there, I think there's most of what we know in the data is there's some happy medium. So definitely on average, sort of parental involvement with kids is good, but there is some evidence that, sort of particularly as kids then leave the home, like if the sort of having a lot of involvement before can then be problematic for mental health. So there's sort of a balance there in that piece. I think the other piece of literature I would draw on is studies where they take kids who are all being bullied. So this is more in the socio-emotional health, like every kid in the study is being bullied. And the question they're asking is not like what keeps you from being bullied, but what helps you like not have mental health consequences of that. And that's basically like, do you have a stable home? And it's actually nothing about like what particular language your parents use or anything. It's just like kids who are in a stable home environment, if they have siblings that they get along with, or they have one friend that's a close friend, that's kind of buoying for those, sort of buoying them into resilience through those things. And so I think for that piece for me is quite actionable, because I think it says just by being there and being the place that your kid can come every day and see you and have someone who loves them, that's it. That's what you're providing. You don't need to fix it. You're not going to go find the bully. Like you're just there.
Does it track with parenting style? Because there's a lot of data around, authoritative parents and authoritarian parents and, yada, yada. Or is it just... I
don't think we're measured in that. I mean, I think it's just like sort of, is there a stable, home environment?
Emily, I want to close with a question about instincts. I am an instinctive person, but I get to spend my life speaking to experts and hearing their wisdom and their research and their data. And over time, I've been sort of like figuring out, how do I balance, right? Cara is a scientist. You are a social scientist. I am neither of those things. What room is there for instinct, for gut, when you're staring down data, when you're staring down kind of like expert wisdom and advice? Like, where's the balancing act there?
I see the data as an input to your decisions. And then there are other inputs. And particularly when we talk about older kids, the tech stuff is a good example. Sleep stuff is a good example. There's an average answer. There's a kind of set of information in the data that you want to pull. And then there's like, what works for my family and like, what is my feeling about what's right for my kid? And actually that instinct thing, like what do I feel is right for my kid? That's really important, because behind that is all of the data that you have about your own kid that is like not in this data on the average. So in some sense, it's not like I would frame it as like, that's not your instinct. That's your like personal data, right? And you get your personal data to the aggregate data and put them together. But I mean, no single piece of average data is going to answer some question about what the right thing to do is. This is something you use, and in many cases, it can be a grounding place to start a conversation or to start an interaction or to start a decision, and then think about, okay, this is what we think works for the average kid or works for the average family, or is the most common thing to do. Like, where would we go from here? And is there something in the data that tells me like one direction is a really bad one? Sometimes you'll see something in the data and be like, wow, I might have had an instinct in that direction, but boy, the data tells me like that's not good, or that really, I should really pause because of the data there. But then from there, when there's a sort of set, it's a starting point. It's a grounding point.
Is it fair to say that Vanessa's instinct, or mine or yours, is essentially data with an N of 1?
Absolutely.
It's just all we know. And you're just comparing it to data collected on a bigger group. And sometimes it's going to align and sometimes it's not.
And Vanessa has an N of 4, by the way.
I was going to say,
you know what? She actually gets credit for twice that.
And even
though
I got a B- in economics at Wellesley,
it's so good that you remember that,
because it's the lowest grade I have ever gotten.
Did you have?
I had chip case.
Yeah,
I did have chip case. Who was beloved and a huge soccer fan and an amazing man, and I was so embarrassed to get such a mediocre grade in his class. All I wanted to do was do well, and it's the lowest grade I got in all of college. So that you can tell I've really let go of that, Emily. But I think, right. So my N of 4, I also have noticed that as my kids have gotten older, I have, as you say, I have more data. I know them better.
Yeah.
Like all of a sudden, the instinct, which apparently is not instinct, but just incredible research I have garnered over, 2 decades.
Yes.
I'm learning to like listen to that quicker and start to kind of not act necessarily, but like begin to process it. And so people who are listening and are at the like early end of puberty or early end of adolescence, either as a teacher or a parent, like it doesn't get easier necessarily, but you get better at it. And I think part of the reason you get better at it is because you're like more comfortable with the data as it's coming in, as opposed to at the beginning where you're like, and
you get to experiment. I mean, on your individual kid, like you get like, I don't mean like in an explicit
way.
Poor kid. But you get to like sort of when your kid has one of these things and you're going to try something. And sometimes when you try something later, you're gonna be like, oh, that did not work. Like that wasn't, but sometimes you'll try something and be like, oh, that seemed to help them. Like they seem to react well to that. Let me modify on that when I come into this situation going forward, because you're going to have a million of a very similar situation with each kid.
And they often have the last laugh because then they try on a new personality or they try on a new style. And suddenly, and this is the beauty of puberty and adolescence, they morph and then you have to up your game. And so I think it's a perfect place to end.
That is a perfect place to end.
Just please come back. We love speaking with you.
This is so great.
Emily, thank you.
I think I'm here to tell you, I think you might be a people person. I don't know how to break it to you, but like.
So now I'm going to go to my medical school. I'm going to apply to medical school. It's not too late.
Come back. You are amazing. Thank you so much for being with us. People are going to freak out when they see your name in our podcast feed.
I'm so excited. Thank you.
You're the best. Thank you.
Thank you.